In most years, the gospel reading for this Sunday after Christmas is the opening part of the gospel according to John, which is also read toward the end of the Christmas Eve service. It's only when Christmas falls on a Sunday, so that the following Sunday is January 1st, and 8 days after the celebration of the birth, that we have the commemoration of the circumcision of Jesus. It was called the Feast of the Circumcision, but in the 1979 prayer book is designated as the Feast of the Holy Name. That's only happened twice since in the 16 years that I've been here at St. James, once in 2006 and once in 2012. But I went back and looked up what I might have said about it at that time, since I don't have any preconceived ideas really about the circumcision. And I found that in 2006 there was a baptism, so I probably talked about that. And that fits in nicely with the theme. In 2012 I couldn't find anything, so I probably just winged it. And there weren't very many people here since it was January 1st. And if you were among them, I apologize in advance, since it occurs to you, oh, there he goes again with all that same stuff about the circumcision. Maybe it's worth hearing twice. We actually don't have any idea when Jesus was circumcised, because we actually don't have any idea when Jesus was born. December 25th was chosen to celebrate the birth because it was the festival of the unconquerable sun. Mistakenly, in Roman times, they thought the solstice fell on December 25th, so the sun started coming back then, which made that celebration appropriate. And it was also the celebration of the official birthday of the Roman Emperor. Whenever Jesus was born, he was almost certainly circumcised 8 days later. All Jewish boys were circumcised on the 8th day after their birth, starting with Isaac and continuing through till today for most. So what the Christian commemoration of that event does is to anchor Jesus in the Jewish tradition. His story is told as the story of the Jewish Messiah. Born in Bethlehem, born of the house of David, circumcised on the 8th day, given the name Jesus, which means rescuer or protector or salvation, as Luke tells us today. In fulfillment, he says, of the angelic prophecy. The gospel reading that we usually have for the Sunday after Christmas: in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, anchored Jesus in the Greek tradition. It was an important step in the transition of Christianity from being simply a sect among many within Judaism to being a faith for the wider world, which at that time was dominated by Greek and Roman thought. Word is a translation of the Greek concept of the logos, which was important in Greek philosophy, and refers not only to the spoken word, but to the rational mind, the logical mind, out of which language proceeds. Its use in the gospel is meant to signify the understanding of Jesus as the embodiment of the mind of God, the creative, expressed Word of God, who creates by speaking, who in fullness was beyond and is beyond space and time and incarnation, but who, according to the writer of Colossians, which is the second option for our epistle today, emptied himself, became one with us, became one of us, so that we might become one with God. The Greeks and the Romans didn't care about the Jewish Messiah. They didn't care about David or his descendants. And this opening section of the fourth gospel was an attempt to translate the meaning of the life of Jesus into this other context. So really, both of these passages, the passage from Luke that we had today that tells about the circumcision, and the passage from John that we usually have about the Logos, the Word, both have to do with the context of the life of Jesus, more than they have to do with any particular content of his biography, his relationship to that context, that culture, have to do with the meaning of Jesus more than with factual information about what may or may not have happened to him or through him. It's the same Jesus, but a different context. The same meaning, but expressed through different cultural symbols, Jewish and Gentile, ritual and philosophical. Now, our faith tradition has gone through a number of such contextual transitions. New clothes to adapt to changing climates. But our hope, our belief is that the core of the teaching, the essence of Christian faith, has been maintained through all these changes, and maintained really because of the changes, which admittedly can always be a pretty tricky thing. It's very possible, in fact, it's really quite common for people to confuse the content with the core, the context with the core. The outer expression gets confused and mistaken for the central truth that's trying to be conveyed. People will often cling strongly to the ways in which the gospel is communicated more strongly than they cling to the gospel itself sometimes. Like the Latin Mass, or the 1928 version of the Book of Common Prayer. Or they may just find it hard to tell the difference between the two, so that they don't dare to change anything for fear of losing everything. That's a kind of innate conservatism in religion that serves a purpose. It can maintain what is mystical, what is beautiful, what is not bound by any particular culture or time. But it can also become idolatrous, worshiping, in a sense, something that's not God. And it can also be misleading because eventually it ends up using language that is no longer understood by the people, using what it says in the 39 Articles of Religion about using a language that is understood by the people. In such a case, you're not just throwing the baby out with the bathwater, you're throwing the baby out and keeping the bathwater to use again and again and again. Now, the church right now is in a time of transition. We need to find new ways to speak our ancient truth because we are called to speak it. Part of the church may be stuck in the 1950s with the old prayer book, but much of the church, I think, seems to be stuck in the 1970s with what's still called the new prayer book, 40 years after it was written, because the people here think that they're still new like they were 40 years ago. We're nostalgic for the full churches and the Sunday schools and the youth groups of the times when baby boomers were coming of age and participating in religious institutions. We try to replicate the sense of purpose and relevance of the civil rights movement or the peace movement. And I suppose that's fine. It certainly speaks to our current demographic makeup. But we need to also find a way to communicate our truth in a way that people who are 40 or under can understand. We need to find ways to say the things that we treasure the most in words that mean something to people who come in this door from a totally different cultural context, from a non-Christian cultural context, maybe with memories of an abusive Christian cultural context. And when they get here, they can be confused, and they can be offended by some of the language that we use. Now, doing that is difficult. It's demanding. It requires your attention and time and dedication and commitment and discipline. It'll take some trial and error. But if we miss this transition, there might not be a second chance. We'll stay stuck in a nice, mystical, beautiful museum that's locked from inside. I'm not talking here about the church against the world. There's always a spirit of the world and a spirit of God that are in tension, always in a kind of opposition that we don't want to really adapt to or adopt. But neither one of those spirits should be confused or identified with a particular culture. Conflicting cultures may be at war, but the core of Christian truth can and should and does have the ability to adapt to any cultural context. The process of this transition, I think, begins with a deep discernment. Discerning who we are, discerning the nature of the context in which we find ourselves, as well as contexts or understandings that may be just beginning. The church is so often, because of its conservatism, looking back and delayed in its progress. And I think it needs to not just catch up, but look forward a bit. And that's a pretty difficult spiritual challenge. Spiritual imperative, if you're going to be serious about your faith. For the church at large, for this parish in particular, for each of our members or those who come and drop in, for me, for you. But New Year's Day seems to me, the Feast of the Holy Name, a good day for us to recognize and name this present challenge. even if we've started that transition already, sometimes without knowing it. We have this treasure in jars of clay, St. Paul tells us, earthen vessels in other translations. And these jars of clay are not just incidental. They can carry the treasure, which can't carry itself, but they can also leak, and they can also be broken, and they can even contaminate that treasure through some kind of decay from inside. We believe that the vessels that we have inherited, along with the treasure, are given by God, even though they may need to be refinished from time to time or replaced from time to time. And I don't really know if this process of transition, this discernment and transition, is harder or easier for a parish our size with a fairly small congregation. We come here mostly in one way or another to meet our own needs in some important and very individualized ways. But we come here as well to give service to others, because we are called as Christians to give service to others. We are ministers who need ministering, all of us. We tend to our own wounds, but we do so in such a way that we're not disabled, because we need at the same time to be engaged in healing the wounds in and of the wider community. And I still believe that God would not call us to do what's not possible. Possible together, possible with the power of the Holy Spirit, but possible. So as I've been told they say in Australia, let's give it a go. Merry Christmas. Happy New Year. Thanks be to God.